Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are so excited to be with all of you tonight. We hope that you will make yourselves at home in the chat and shout out where you're watching from. We already see a lot of really warm excitement going on, a lot of geeked out comments, so keep those coming. I am really honored first to introduce our conversation partner, Imani Perry. Imani is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She's the author of 6 books, including the critically acclaimed Breathe, A Letter to My Sons, which Charis was honored to host her for a party for a little while back, and the award-winning Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, as well as May We Forever Stand, A History of the Black National Anthem. Perry's creative nonfiction work has appeared in publications such as The Atlantic, The Paris Review, The New York Times, and she frequently provides commentary for documentaries on Black history, art, and culture. Perry holds a Ph.D. in American Studies from Harvard University, a J.D. from Harvard Law School, an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center, and a BA from Yale College. She currently lives in the Philadelphia area with her 2 sons, and she has a book forthcoming in the fall, which we are very excited about as well. So welcome back, Dr. Imani Perry. We're thrilled to have you.
Thrilled to be here.
And we're here tonight to celebrate the work of Chanda Prescod-Weinstein. She is an assistant professor of physics and astronomy and core faculty in women's and gender studies at the University of New Hampshire. She is also a columnist for New Scientist and Physics World. Her research in theoretical physics focuses on cosmology, neutron stars, and dark matter, and she is active in Black feminist science, technology, and society studies. Essence magazine recognized her as one of 15 Black women who are paving the way in STEM and breaking barriers. She has been profiled in several venues, including TechCrunch, Ms. Magazine, Huffington Post, Gizmodo, Nylon, and the African American Intellectual History Society's Black Perspectives. A co-founder of the Particles for Justice movement, she has received the 2017 LGBT plus Physicist Acknowledgement of Excellence Award for her contributions to improving conditions for marginalized people in physics, as well as the 2021 American Physical Society Edward A. Boucher Award for her contributions to particle cosmology. She is the author of the book we are here to celebrate and discuss tonight, The Disordered Cosmos, A Journey into Dark Matter, Spacetime, and Dreams Deferred. So welcome to you both. And one more thing, one housekeeping thing, I want to welcome our friends from the Auburn Avenue Research Library. They will be dropping all kinds of knowledge in the chat. And I don't want you to get overwhelmed or anxious and feel like you have to click all the links at once, because you can go back at the end of the chat and revisit the links. You can also just come back anytime you want and revisit this conversation at the same URL. So it will be here. Do not feel pressed. It's all going to be here for you. So please kick back and relax. If you have any questions, you can put them in this Ask a Question box at any time. So please sit back, relax, make yourselves at home, and let's get ready to dig into this incredible conversation.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Before we get started with the discussion, I'm going to read an excerpt from chapter 9, which is entitled The Anti-patriarchy, a Gender. A realization that it took years for me to come to was that the treatment of Black women can teach us a lot about the general practice of science and the ways in which it is a deeply broken practice. White empiricism, a concept I developed for an article that appeared in the academic feminist studies publication, Signs, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, is a practice of ignoring information about the real world that isn't considered to be valuable or specifically important to the physics community at large, which is oriented toward valuing the ideas and data that are produced by white men. In my paper, I developed this argument by using the specific example of how Black women are treated in the scientific workplace and juxtaposing it against a debate about whether actual observations and experiments are necessary to support theories of quantum gravity. Black women are constantly asked to provide hard, evidence for our evaluations of our most commonplace experiences with discrimination, yet white men are taken seriously when they suggest that more affirming data isn't necessary in order to test their theories of quantum gravity. In other words, the way Black women are treated within the physics community is the canary in the coal mine for all women and gender minorities. Empiricism is the ideological premise of the scientific method, the idea that meaningful information about the world is gathered through human senses: sight, touch, smell, sound, and taste. Experiments are an empirical activity. I think this is a great way to gather information. The problem is that not all empirical data is equally accessible, because social asymmetries, differences, mean that we don't all have access to the same sensory experiences. And as Alexis Shotwell discusses in Knowing Otherwise, Race, Gender, and Implicit Understanding, there are other ways of knowing that aren't purely empirical. A white person can never know what it's like to be Black from a first-person perspective. This perspective, the person's standpoint, affects what data they can personally sense. You might assume that this has little to do with physics. After all, the law of gravitation has little relationship to what anyone thinks, no matter how much melanin is in their skin. But it's worth remembering that developments in physics are built collectively through a human community that is constantly assessing the value of certain problems and making choices about who works for them. Imagine, for instance, that a Black woman working at the boundary of what is known in physics has a fresh but controversial idea about it. Do you think her idea will be taken as seriously as it would be if a white man said the same thing? In a context where Black women are disbelieved about our expertise, our ability to contribute to communal knowledge production is fundamentally at risk. At the same time, white string theory who argue that empiricism is no longer a good scientific standard because it doesn't support their favorite theory for quantum gravity are taken seriously and encouraged to explore the implications of their ideas. This is one side of white empiricism, where misogynoir, a term coined by Moya Bailey and expanded by Trudy to describe the specific practice of white supremacist patriarchy against Black women, shapes which concepts are taken seriously in the scientific community. White men can question empiricism entirely, while Black women are questioned for practicing it at all. In other words, white supremacy operates in science as a form of anti-intellectual, anti-empiricism. If the testimony of some people does not matter, it means that we are not evaluating evidence on its own terms, but rather evaluating evidence on the terms of who the evidence comes from. Someone who enjoys playing devil's advocate might argue that our evaluation of evidence is always contingent on our level of trust for the person who provides it, and that this is not inherently a bad thing. Yet we know the fundamental suspicion of Black people is violently dangerous and fundamentally racist. And it should be a given that it is also inherently bad to treat non-Black, trans, and genderqueer people with suspicion. The idea that some information is more suspicious because of who provides it is incredibly dangerous when the evaluation is based on ascribed identities. Patriarchy, the system where men are a class of socially, politically, and physically dominant people, is what I call a total system. It touches, shapes, and ultimately distorts everything in our lives. I did not understand this as a young girl who was learning about sexism, and I didn't understand it as a young woman who was combating sexism either. I didn't understand that prejudice against women was rooted in a total system that, like and entangled with white supremacy, was creating what Melissa Harris Perry calls, quote, the crooked room that I was trying to stand up straight in. The evolution of the system began in early modern Europe in the ideas of 17th century English philosopher and Dr. John Locke. In Vexy Thing on Gender and Liberation, Imani Perry explains how the concept of human has historically been constructed specifically in relation to man rather than woman. Quote, the construct of man for Locke was a relation of property. Locke's definition was a relation that depended on sovereign authority. As Europeans traveled the globe, the sovereign authority granted them rights to property relations that were also effectively rights of conquest, end quote. In other words, the idea of a human was entangled with an early form of manifest destiny for men. From the point of view of the Europeans who eventually founded the United States and Canada, someone is human if they are a propertied European man. And if someone or something is a European man or a state representing them, then they have a legal right to all the property they can get their hands on. patriarchy isn't just prejudice against women, but instead a total system that says white men can own anything, including the capacity to determine other people's rights, or even, in the instance of white empiricism, the ability to determine what evidence is required in determining reality.
Well, thank you for the citation. But much more importantly, this is really an extraordinary book, and I am not saying that to make you blush, but but you should. It's unbelievable. I was trying to figure out how to describe what I think it does in a cogent way, and I don't know if I'll get there. But part of it is that you're a person who asks the question why, and always have been, and you describe this in your story, and you are interested in understanding the why at the kind of particulate level and also the expansive ways, right? And then in the process of kind of where you demystify and deconstruct the cosmos for us, and then see and encourage us to see our places in it. And then you don't do that the way so often people do, and then kind of make that a kind of disembodied formulation, but actually draw us into, okay, so now let's see all of these configurations that we've set up that don't have to be the way they are, right? They are the way they are. We get insight from, but they don't have to be. And so it's this kind of radically imaginative, beautiful work. I think that, if I had read this, if I'd had this younger, I might have liked physics. I mean, I certainly would have been inspired by it, because you answer all of my curiosity about the way the world works without it feeling disconnected. So all that to say, thank you.
Thank you.
And the first question I wanted to ask you and to kind of draw out of you, one of the many things that is remarkable is you, from the very beginning, you really talk about the sociality of physics. Right. So, and I'm drawing attention to that because, you talk about white empiricism, and in the piece you just engaged about the sort of the idea of a total system from the framework of white men. And in a way, you also talk about the way physics has been narrated as a history of these solo kind of singular white male geniuses. And you deconstruct that, and you give us lots of alternative examples, but you also talk about it as a field that has a sociality embedded in it, both in the process of discovery and in the process of labor, right? Like, what is the work? I think we may have lost you, but you asked the question. Chanda, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So we'll keep going. You also talk about, who does the work, who cleans the lab, who makes physics possible in a broader way. So can you talk a little bit about why that's so important, the social aspect?
Yeah, I mean,
everybody can see you. I just can't see you. Sorry.
Okay. Oh no, that makes me a little bit sad. Okay. I think from my point of view, the book is a holistic look at the doing of physics, and it is in some sense a reflection of the question that drives my interest in physics, which is, why is the world the way that it is? And kind of the unfolding of the understanding that that question goes in a lot of different directions. So there are the answers that we would consider to be pure physics or just physics. These questions of what is the standard model particle physics? How did galaxies form? What is the role that dark matter plays in the formation of galaxies? Why do we never find quarks by themselves? So why are quarks always in duos and trios and these kinds of things? So that's one answer to how the universe comes to be physically constructed, but it also doesn't actually answer, like, why did I have the experiences being a physics concentrator in college that I had? Why did people keep telling me that I didn't look like a physics major? And then making up like completely BS excuses when it was like really clear like why I was getting that question, right? Mm-hmm. I had a lot of whys, and so I think, you know, the question of white empiricism, I think sometimes people are a little bit surprised about why I came to white empiricism, the concept. And it was really in part because I was reading feminist philosophy of science. I was reading feminist standpoint theory, which I don't name it in that section, but that's what I'm introducing when I start talking about standpoints, is this idea of feminist standpoint theory. And the critique in feminist standpoint theory has really been primarily of the life sciences and the social sciences, that the perspective of the knower matters. So it matters if you only run your vaccine trial, to pick a very present example for us, on men. It matters if you only pick people with a certain set of chromosomes and not another set of chromosomes. It matters if you're not thinking about, like, some of us are taking hormones for various reasons, right? And so how you design your experiment can have real life implications. And what I was seeing in the literature is that people would always say, but physics is the epistemic exception because the laws of physics are universal. And I was like, wait, but I was reading feminist standpoint theory because all of this is completely consistent with my experience in physics. So maybe I, as a physicist, need to step in and say, no, actually it applies to physics as well. And so that was kind of where that came from. But all of it was me trying to articulate, the world works this way. Why? How do I describe it?
Mm-hmm. 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 And you describe it, and you're constantly giving us as readers alternatives, right? Both in terms of sort of questioning the taken for granteds that exist in the way that we are taught science. I was fascinated by your discussions of sort of moments in formal education where you said, okay, well, we're just given this as if sort of taken for granted, but in fact, there's a lot more behind it. But, sort of, let's just deal with this so we can move on. And I thought that was so profound. I also, I felt very keenly, even you don't get to talking about your mother, Margaret Prescott, until the second half of the book, but I felt very keenly that she is present in all throughout and in the nature of your inquiry. And, I think that's also just really important, just in terms of the way that we think about how the path to becoming an intellectual, but also because she's not a scientist, but she's clearly part of how you are a scientist.
Yes, I think that this is really, and for folks who haven't picked up the book or seen any of the discussions about it, the book ends with a letter to my mother, which I'll just contextualize for everyone. My mom didn't know about that letter until October, when we had about a week before the book got to the point where they were paginating and indexing, and there was no way to take things out of it beyond like a word or two. And I sent her and I was like, you have 1 week, tell me if you hate this and don't want it in the book. And the letter went, I would say the letter is one of the things I worked hardest at. And I also just want to say like why it's there. So earlier in the book, I have this chapter, Wages for Scientific Housework. And so it is kind of closing a loop. My mom was one of the founders of Black Women for Wages for Housework. And so I grew up in this household where we were talking about unwaged work, and I wanted to acknowledge my mom's unwaged caring work of giving birth to me and raising me primarily as a single parent, in producing me as a scientist and creating the opportunities, even, and there are stories that aren't in there, like taking me to see A Brief History of Time, spending the gas money to go from the East Side to the West Side for a matinee, because that's all she could afford, to take me to see this documentary when I was 10 years old that introduced me to particle physics and cosmology, because she thought that maybe it would speak to me. And so my mom also has like this incredible math anxiety, that she thinks that she can't do math. She thinks she's not good at that stuff. But also when I was in high school, she was like, neutrinos are really cool. And I'm like turning 39 this year, and I have only just looped around to understanding exactly how cool neutrinos are. My mom's a very fashion forward person. If you go for a test, will be the best dressed person there. But I'm realizing she's like fashion forward even scientifically, right? And so I wanted to acknowledge my mom as part of the scientific story. And I think for me, this was an important thread in the book, to acknowledge that there are lots of people we might not put the label of scientist on who are part of the scientific story. And as I say, that science is a collective effort. It is not the effort of a singular person. So I think, and I will say, like, as far as the values that are expressed in the book, my mom is my most significant influence politically. So if people are wondering, like, how I turned out the way that I did, talk to Margaret Prescott. She'll tell you that me asking why a lot was real annoying, because I wanted explanations for everything. But it is also the case that she found ways to support me doing that in ways that didn't annoy her. And I think that was the other thing, is that at points my mom and I had a difficult relationship because we are very similar in some ways. And I wanted to thank her publicly and say to her publicly that I was proud to have turned out like her. So that was a big piece of it too.
Absolutely beautiful and really important because a part of the demystification for me is that you revealed the making of a scientist in ways that feel very humanizing, because they do not require you talk about the labors of your mother and opening up opportunities, but your own intellectual curiosity being the most important thing, right? Even when there was the various kinds of adversities and barriers. And I think the story, and I may mispronounce it, but Mauna Kea in Hawaii, and your decision not to go there. I don't know if you can tell it, but I thought it was so profound.
Yeah. So for context, for people who are not familiar with me, I grew up in working class East Los Angeles. We were, I guess I've always articulated us as like working class household, but my mom's recently been like, Chanda, you just need to tell people we were poor. I had unusual amounts of social capital. And so I feel like I need to say that as well, because my mom was an organizer. I had access to resources through her network, which I just want to say, activist networks are really reflecting the world that we want in doing that for each other. And so I was, one of the reasons I went to Harvard for college was because it was one of the only schools I could afford. I couldn't afford any of the UCs when I got into 5 of them. And I was a Pell Grant student. I was a federal work study student. I was definitely one of the, not the poorest, but I was one of the poorest students in my class at Harvard. And so halfway through college, where I had really been struggling, my grades were not great. I had questioned many times, like, whether I should stay as a physics major. Someone offered me the opportunity to take a 1-year job at a telescope in Hawaii. And this was a job that would have paid like twice what my mom raised me on. And it's the sort of thing I was already aware at that point that if I did something like this, it would write my ticket for graduate school admissions. Because when you have that kind of experience, it's such a huge thing to have on your application. And so I was like, yes, I'm finally getting a break, and I'm gonna have this money. I'm gonna be able to call home and be like, I've gotten this opportunity. Plus at the time I had like these very simple ideas about Hawaii. So I was like, awesome, Hawaii for a year. And I think like the day after I got the opportunity, I started using Yahoo, because that's what we did back in the day for the young ones, to look things up, and found out that there was a picket line of Native Hawaiians on the Mauna, as it's sometimes called, because it was unceded indigenous land, and they felt that the building of telescopes was a desecration to the land. And I had to tell the guy who had offered me the opportunity, that wasn't even competitive, he was handpicking me, that I couldn't take the job. And it was, I grew up in a union family too. My dad's the labor organizer. I couldn't cross the picket line. I didn't even really understand the whole thing. I had a very, beginner level understanding, but I understood we don't cross picket lines and we do solidarity. That's the end of the conversation. And I just to give a historical context, I was fresh off of being involved in the Harvard Living Wage campaign sit-in Tent City that had happened in spring of 2001 in Mass Hall at Harvard. And so this was something that was very fresh for me, that both I had sacrificed my grades semester and was desperate to prove my mettle as a physicist, but also to not allow my desire to become a physicist to cause me to compromise my values. And I think that was the first challenge I experienced. The first real challenge I experienced with that was having to say no to something that really could have written my ticket.
And that section made me very emotional. And I think the way that you described the context is really important, because I do think that there are times, and I have a similar experience that, if you grow up in kind of organizer circles, oftentimes there is a social capital, a sort of access to books and bodies of knowledge, and not a class, not a kind of bourgeois class position. And so there's a kind of interstitial space. And when you get into these academic environments, there's a great deal of pressure to just sort of go along with sort of the access, and to have that critical voice in the back of your head, and a decision to hold fast to those commitments, even once you see what the abundance that is yours for the taking is one of those kind of early tests of values when you leave the nest, as it were, right? And then you go on to describe the process of learning about kind of the indigeneity and cosmology in the context of Hawaii.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about that in hindsight, and I don't want to be too hard, like I'm 19, so I was still figuring things out. But when we talk about curiosity and decisions about what data is interesting and what data is important, I wasn't curious enough about that land claim conversation to think past it. And I didn't investigate beyond seeing picket line. And actually, I think like my decision at that point was, I don't even know if I agree with them being on the picket line. I just know that I'm not going to spend the rest of my life remembering that I had crossed one, because like that was ground into me that we just don't do that. And so that means I started a PhD program in astronomy at UC Santa Cruz 2 years later. And the reason that this is particularly salient is that the University of California Observatories is the managing organization for the Keck telescopes on Mauna Kea. And actually some of the financial largesse that I benefited from in the astronomy department at UC Santa Cruz, which the UC observatories are headquartered at Santa Cruz. So it was literally physically in the building where all of the management was there. I was benefiting financially from the infrastructure that was doing all of this work in Hawaii. And in fact, at one point, I went on a paid trip that was paid for by monies that were coming through there to Haleakala, which is another piece of contested land where there have been telescopes built, and visited an Air Force telescope there as part of an educational event that we were being taken through. And again, didn't ask a lot of questions. Although in that moment, I started to ask myself questions about why do we keep talking about Native Hawaiians learning to be technicians and not becoming astronomers like us? Mm-hmm. And this is supposed to be celebrated. Also, we were being followed around by military police who had guns while we were touring the telescope. And we were being told that the telescope was there so that they could watch missile tests and track missiles as they were going over the Pacific, right? And this is I think, again, that was a moment where I was But again, I didn't really ask questions about it until in late 2014, which is just to give people timelines. So that trip, I think, was in 2005. So this is a decade later. When another telescope is maybe being built on Mauna Kea. There's been enough resistance that they've been able to stop it. This is the 30-meter telescope, if anyone wants to look it up. And Native Hawaiian Kanaka Maoli resistance to the building reached the point where people got arrested on the Mauna defending the land. And it made the news, and discussion about it exploded in astronomy groups on Facebook, including in a diversity and inclusion group. And at that point, I started hearing people saying racist, pejorative things. They don't know what's good for them. This telescope is good for the economy. And at some point, a Lakota graduate student started writing about how hard it was for her to see this conversation. And she was someone that I saw as kind of a little sister who I had done support work for, and I felt I couldn't let her talk about that alone. And to bring my mom into this, she's from Barbados, and it's a small island. And I thought, if this were my island, would I want people to stand with me? And the answer was yes. And so I started saying, I don't think that the telescope should be built here. And there's a chapter in the book, I don't remember what the number is right now, where I talk about lessons from the Mauna. I want to say that Native Hawaiian people, being in conversation with them in that moment, taught me so much about if I was going to continue being a scientist and to have the values that I proclaimed, that I was going to have to start understanding my work in a very different way. And so that was a very tough moment. I actually almost quit. I was like, I can't work with all these racist jerks. I don't even know what is astronomy if astronomy is this like colonial crap. But then actually I realized that maybe what I have to do is start thinking about, what does astronomy look like without colonialism? What does that conversation look like? And it is the struggle of the Kanaka Maoli that pushed me to that point. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
No,
but
it's exactly what I was hoping you would say, because you have this line, and I'm not going to get it exactly. It's so beautifully stated, where you're like, what are the conditions for all of our children to see the Milky Way, right? And so what you just said resonates so deeply for me. I mean, it just, because it's like changed the frame of reference, or the way you quote a mutual friend from long ago, Yinde, saying, let's think about what we're for as opposed to just what we're against. And I would just say, thank you to you for the book, but also your disposition, because one of the things that you are consistent about is you will always talk about the way we are implicated, right, in the unflinchingly, consistently, right? But you also refuse to take the position, which I think lots of professionals and intellectuals and scholars do, where it's just sort of like, I won't discuss the various forms of oppression that I encounter because I occupy this. No, you're like thoroughgoing all the way through these institutions, pushing these questions consistently, driven very clearly by this question: what are we for? Or how do we create the world that allows, you say it more elegantly, but like children to witness, the beauty of the world.
It's worth just saying that Allende made that remark to me. Let's not just know what we're against, but also what we're for. Around the time that I had that trip to Hawaii, when I was a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz, and I was doing labor organizing. I was an officer in UAW 2865, which is the academic student employees, if there are any in the audience, hey. And I think I was very angry about a lot of things. And I think until I wrote this and then went to Allende and was like, is it okay if I put this in the book? I'm not sure Allende realized that that had stayed with me. But he had really said to me, and I think that this is something that those of us who are doing organizing work, we're always at risk of being so pissed, understandably, just raging, angry, and it makes sense. I think particularly if people haven't worked out why there are so many reasons over the last 4 years, you may be unhelpable, but there were reasons to be that level of pissed before the last 4 years happened. that it is easy to just be like, I'm against this, I'm against this, I'm against this. And I think that, you know, Allende is also a movement baby, and something that he and I are always talking about is that when you're doing movement organizing, it is valuable to have in mind the world that you want on the other side of your fight. Because if you organize your entire mentality and world around yourselves, and I should say I'm speaking for myself here, not Allende. Don't blame Allende for anything I say you don't agree with. But when you build your entire movement about shit that you hate,
oh yeah.
You don't have a landing destination that honors your humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And if I was going to offer a critique of the movement that I grew up in, I heard a lot of we're against this, here's one thing that we want. But I didn't hear like this is an articulation of our future. And so I think that made me think, what would I do differently? And I think I latched on to Afrofuturism, even if I wasn't always thinking of that word.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see this being in that vein, that also if you think about what do we need for Black children to just like have the opportunity to enjoy the night sky, any Black child. So not just like your token light-skinned person with the right social capital and the ability to do well on tests at the right stage in their life.
Right.
Any Black child, then that means that everybody's got clean water. Like everybody in Jackson has clean water. Everybody in Flint has clean water, right? We have clean water, we have healthcare, we have housing, everybody's well fed, nobody's working like 80-hour weeks. You change all of those conditions and then we enjoy the night sky, and enjoying the night sky is like a glamorous, beautiful, wonderful, simple, however you want to frame it, goal to have on the other end, because it is the thing that our ancestors evolved under.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something we do as a storytelling species. As Sylvia Wynter says, we are a storytelling species. We look up at the sky and we wonder, so how can we become our full human selves? That has to somehow involve having the freedom to come back to that.
Mm-hmm.
But that requires like changing everything.
It does, right? And that's what I love. I mean, you can hone in on these possible future moments, and it's about the environment, and it's about access, and it's about knowledge, and there's all these layers of what it's about, but such a breathtaking and simple like hope, right? I mean, and for me that's also you read from it, but I want to talk more broadly about the anti-patriarchy agender chapter, because you start that chapter sort of about, you know, the way in which physicists can reject binaries in their research work, but have a lot of trouble rejecting binaries in this sort of human sociality, right? And then move on to talk about sort of both the importance of recognition of human beings categorically more fully, but also a space for that which is unnamed or not. And you describe yourself as a gender dropout, which I just think is such a kind of beautiful formulation to be like, I'm not, you know, just that's whatever that thing has been constructed to be doesn't suit me. Right?
Yeah, I have to say, and you know, for people who haven't picked up the book, again, there's a chapter called Rape as Part of the Scientific Story in the book. And so you might actually think that that was the hardest chapter for me to write. But in a lot of ways, that was a chapter I had been writing for years. And it actually, in the chapter, I talk about how it came out by accident, really, that I started writing it. And so actually, the anti-patriarchy agender was was the hardest chapter for me to write. And I think it's the one that still sits most uncomfortably with me. Although I think the other one was actually the physics of melanin. I'll just say that. And I want to name Autumn Kent, who's a mathematician who sat me down with like one version of it and was like, here's the way that this chapter is like a hot mess. Let's see if we can fix it. So I also want to tell people that happens even if you're someone who has a book deal, that people sit you down and you're like, we need to work on this. I think the way that I would like to think about this chapter now is that this is the one that I'm constantly still writing, which is, how do I, as someone who doesn't experience an internal sense of gender, continue to articulate myself as someone who still feels comfortable with the label of woman and understands that I move through the world being perceived in a particular way, in a particular gendered way. How do I articulate what my relationship to trans identity is in that context in a way that is respectful to a broad community of people who are pushing on the boundaries of gender? And somewhere in that chapter, I talk about Jose Esteban Munoz and queerness as futurity. I don't remember if that's exactly how I say it.
Yeah.
But I think I want to think of that chapter being in that vein, which is and ironically, very similar to the doing of science, in that queerness is always in the future. It's always on the boundary of what we know and what we don't know. And that's actually, if for whatever reason you're in the audience and you've seen me give a physics colloquium about my research recently, you've heard me say, for the students in the audience, I want you to know that science is at the boundary of what we know and don't know. That's the practice of a scientist. And so I think that part of what's coming out in this chapter, although I don't think I articulate it as clearly as I will for you now, that science is queer.
Yeah.
Because it is at the boundary of what we know and what we don't know, and we are in some sense writing the story of the world, and that is what queerness does. And so I was very non-committal in the chapter about here is how things should be defined, but rather trying to offer people, these are the different ways people are having conversations about these questions of gender. And yes, I also wanted to make a very pointed comment about the fact that wave particle duality, physicists are yeah, we can work with that. Somehow we're still having debates about pronouns with scientists, and it's but you accept quantum mechanics. I think now, if I was writing the chapter, and this is me editing in real time, right, I would say that the takeaway may be, I open with an example of a non-binary drag queen, Amru Al-Qadi, who works primarily in Britain. And them talking about how their identity as a non-binary person is completely intuitive when you consider that something can be a particle and a wave at the same time. Yes. And I was like, oh, so we keep telling everyone that quantum mechanics is not intuitive, but it's probably very intuitive for people who are non-binary. Mm-hmm. So intuition is contextual and social, and that's the sociality of intuition in physics.
See, but so I'll say, I think that you absolutely did that and I think you do this throughout the book. And what I mean by this is there's a holding place, right, that we all have. The holding place can be implicated in marginalization and oppression, or the holding place can actually be pushing us in new directions, but neither are the complete we're always work. I mean, that's why I think it's clear science is queer, but also living is too, right? Because if one has a curious disposition towards existence, right? So it's all it's all the way through, right? So you get to, it's at the very end of the chapter that you quote Munoz, and it's perfect because it's, okay, yes, it's incredibly important. We must not misgender people. We must not refuse recognition. We must, and there's also that which is not yet realized, right? That we have to live with as well as part of this journey, right? I found that incredibly compelling, particularly, and you discuss this with and you engage with Riley Snorton's work in this section about the problem of murderous inclusion, which I think is a phenomenon in this sort of, we're stuck in this moment of sort of the how you include others discourse, which, you know, is limiting, to say the least, right? I mean, is that in a
Yeah, so I want to the Endless Frontier Act, which was something that was introduced in Congress last spring. And I saw that it was getting circulated among particle physicists today, where people were asking the question of, do we need to be responsive to this Endless Frontier Act? So I want to point to the name before even talking about like what it is, to just say, like, how is it that we're in 2021 and we're talking about diversity and inclusion on the one hand, and Endless Frontier, which, like, you know, the manifest destiny is so embedded in it. And so this was ostensibly a bill that is supposed to inject more money into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I should say that, like, that's not evenly distributed. Like, I looked at that and I was like, oh, so particle physics is not going to be a priority here. It's going to be quantum information. It's going to be quantum computing, because that's the new darling of the military. Particle physics is no longer the military's darling. I'm not sure particle physics have fully sat with the implications of that, but for any in the audience, y'all, we are basically artists now. And so we need to, like, be in solidarity with the folks who know what it's like to be, you know, either not the darling or in fact, like, the direct target. But this Endless Frontier Act is also articulated as, well, China is going to beat us. We got to do something about China. Which, like, you know, fast forward to a year later, we're seeing a rise in anti-Asian violence. And you know, as the spouse of a Taiwanese American, this has been really scary for me. But I think we also need to ask questions about how, you know, the government, even though, like, Ro Kina was one of the sponsors of that bill, is actually playing a role in that. So, you know, what does this all have to do with the question of, like, murderous inclusion? The argument that you're supposed to make when you go to the National Science Foundation and ask for money for diversity and inclusion, and the way it's been articulated by the National Science Board, is that this is a matter of national importance because our workforce needs to reflect American diversity so that the numbers stay up, so that we can compete in a global environment and have an American workforce. It's always been. So when we're talking about diversity and inclusion in science, where the money for that comes from is usually, yes, it would be, it's good to have Black people's labor. And I just, like, I say it like that because people really need to hear that, like, you know, supposedly we're all supposed to get over slavery, but the logic is still we are capital, and that our intellectual curiosity, our joy at looking at the night sky, can't be honored for the humanity that it represents, but has to be honored for the capital that it offers to the American technological enterprise. And I think that we as Black people in science, and Black intellectuals in general, and Black people in general, we have to resist that narrative simply because sometimes it gets us the thing that we want in the immediate. We have to be resistant to being framed as labor source, because this country's been there and done that, and we live in the wake of slavery, as Christina Sharp has articulated it. But I don't think that we need to carry its values with us as part of our future building, and that has to be what we refuse. Mm-hmm. So I what was interesting to me, actually, in reading Riley Snorton's work, was seeing that was so much more clearly articulated in Black trans studies mm-hmm. than it was anywhere else. That's right. Actually, in Black thought. Mm-hmm. That there was a clarity there that I had felt lonely in that clarity, and then saw that, and I was like, yes, yeah, this is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I mean, I feel, first of all, your citation practices are to be modeled, because every moment you engage in a text, it is completely sincere. I mean, it's not, just, oftentimes people are just citing to sort of throw things, but and what becomes clear in your practices is what you say explicitly about what it means to have a standpoint approach, where you actually turn frames of reference to have a deeper understanding. It becomes evident in all of the folks you engage with. I have to say, relatedly, and this is I have a question, but it's a hard one to articulate. But okay, so I felt, as someone who has worked in critical theory, that your work responded to a problem that we have that is rooted in kind of Cartesian anxieties about, subject-object relations, self-other, right? And that sort of, even when critiquing that frame, because we wound up bound with that frame, it becomes very hard to do something more than describe what's wrong and to actually imagine other forms of relation, right? And that's what we desperately need, right? So we wind up still, like, for lack of a better term, in some ways replicating the very terms of murderous inclusion sometimes, because we don't know how to, like, think beyond the sort of conventions of self and other, inside, outside, right? And so how do we bring the outside inside, which, we all want to get, or most of us want to get past, but then our language winds up kind of making us beholden. So I felt like your book actually is giving us a language to think beyond that. And so, one, I sort of wanted to know if you were doing that explicitly. I think you were, even though you don't fuss at those of us in critical theory, but also about, what it means for you to work across these fields and think across these fields that are so often deeply isolated from each other.
Yeah, I think that there's struggle around this in the book, right? Because, like, I am still, at the end of the day, someone who really loves particle physics.
Yes.
And I talk in I think it's in the first chapter in I Heart Quarks, about reading Karen Barad's critiques. And I really think of Karen as my foreperson, as a trained particle theorist who moved into doing feminist studies work, and who has done, like, incredibly important work challenging orthodoxies about how we place value on particle physics, and also what we think it's telling us about the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. And I talk about, like, my deep discomfort with that. And so actually, one of the struggles I've had with this book is realizing that people were so hungry for something that would engage with Black and Indigenous ways of thinking and knowing the world, that they were hoping that my book would do that. And I don't think that my book necessarily does that in the ways that people expect it to. But I think my hope is that, even though that has not been my ministry, at least not yet, that the book creates room for that Black, Indigenous person for whom that is their ministry, for their work to have space time, for them to have space time to exist and be able to get that work done and write their own book. Like, even in saying, like, if this book can be, like, moderately successful, then it gets easier for someone else to do something that publishers are like, huh? Which, like, shout out to Katie O'Donnell for not having that reaction at all and being like, yes, let's do this. And so, but I will say that I think that when it comes to our anxiety of, like, how are we going to solve the problem, I think, just going back to Allende's comment, it's okay to have a vague idea of what you are. It doesn't have to be exact and perfectly outlined and in your, like, day planner with a project plan and all of that. It is okay to be like, I know that my goal is for people to have the freedom to look at the night sky. And then, like, let's backtrack and figure out, like, what are the things that necessitates? Okay, it necessitates these things. These are I don't know, what people would call hard political problems. I'm making a face about that a little bit because we did quantum field theory. We built the Large Hadron Collider. The JWST, the next generation Hubble, is about to go to L2, like on the other side of the freaking moon. We just landed something on Mars again. I think that we can solve these problems. Like, we are clearly a very competent problem-solving species. It's okay to not have the answers immediately in front of you. And I think that maybe I bring that perspective to the table as a scientist, because when you're doing research as a scientist, you are sitting down with a problem that the answer is not obvious to, and then working through, okay, let me try this tool on it. Oh, that netted something interesting. I will write a paper about it because it yielded new information. I tried this tool. It did not work. That's unfortunate. I wanted to get a paper out of it and I didn't, right? But we are constantly problem solving and getting stuck and getting unstuck and being comfortable with being uncomfortable, as the Mennonites say. So
yeah,
I think as Mariam Kaba says, often on Twitter, she likes to remind us hope is a practice.
Yes.
That thinking about the future is a practice, and it's okay if your vision changes. You should constantly practice having a vision. And I think that I hope that the book points in that direction, which is it's that you have to practice having a vision. Here is one. Here is something to focus on as you're working your vision out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have some questions that I'm going to turn to. So from Alicia, this diversity and inclusion work has started to become a major conversation in my field and workplace also. But as a person of color, it has been exhausting, even though it's necessary. How have you been able to stay curious and protecting your emotional health in these conversations?
So I guess one thing I'll say, this is like maybe a strange thing to do in a book talk, but pieces of the book, for anybody who's familiar with my writing, you'll see there are pieces of things that I published online, like scattered throughout the book. There's an essay called Diversity is a Dangerous Setup, which is available for free on my Medium, where I'm basically, I say diversity is a dangerous setup. So I just want to point people to that, because I think that it can be, it's a book review. It's a review of a book by Jonathan Kahn, who really challenges the way that implicit bias has made its way into the conversation in jurisprudence, and how that has really shaped our ability to challenge explicit racism by having everyone running around being like, I didn't mean to do it. My brain did it without me having a choice about it. And that's exhausting, because it feels like gaslighting, because it's like, well, I managed to make the choice to not do that. So like, yes, you can, right? Like, si se puede. So I think like part of how I get through it is I'm critical of it. I think my critique, in some sense, at every stage of my career, I mean, I'll say that, like, I'm Margaret Prescott's daughter, and so I was trained to go into a room when I see a problem, try and solve it. Sometimes too frequently, we both have this problem. But it is also the case that at some point when I was a graduate student, I realized there was all this racism, there was all this sexism. One way to articulate it is that you get tired, but actually the other piece of it is the thing that's making you tired is that you are building up energy inside of you. You're building up the thoughts and the challenges and your response to it inside of you. And part of what makes you tired is having to hold on to that and hold it in. And I was like, I'm either quitting physics or I'm fixing physics. And so I just let it out. And that's also risky. I have a faculty position in a department that doesn't have any optical astronomers in it, really. And I don't think after the discourse about Mauna Kea that that's a total coincidence. People in astronomy were really mad at me. And I'm sure like Imani can remember me talking to her about like, I don't know if I'm going to make it, if I'm going to get a faculty position. For me as a light-skinned person, there are some things there that like I experience less racism than other people do. And so I can push in ways that other people can't get away with. I do try to use that to effect to the extent that I can, right? so we are all in different social locations, and our ability to push and our financial situation that gives us that flexibility and that room. But that, for me, that was what I had to do, is I had to let it out. And I had to realize that I don't know, I'm from East LA. So the thing that I will reference is the pata, that like I had to like die on my feet rather than live on my knees. And that was like how I had to go into every situation.
It's such a brilliant point to make that I think is so rarely made, is how much the exhaustion comes from swallowing and holding things in. It is because it wears on you. And it's I love that you say that too, because it's one of the lessons that my organizer parents always, they were like, let it out. You have two choices, swallow it or let it out, right? And I think it's really true. Okay, so one of the other questions is, you mentioned Star Trek multiple times in the book. What do you think is the most important lesson we as scientists can learn from Trek, or other sci-fi for that matter?
Okay, so like I'm a huge like Star Trek convention attending Star Trek fan. Like if you go to the convention, you will find me there. You will find me actually organizing things for Black people at the convention. That's like one of my passions. And I'll just say, like, to my left, I'm not going to rotate my screen because I will mess things up. There is a whole mess of like Star Trek. I have an Uhura Barbie. I have Nichelle Nichols autograph, picture of Nichelle Nichols looking fine. I have a photo of me and Sonequa Martin Green that she autographed. I also have a drawing, actually, that one of my Black folks from the Star Trek convention had, of all of the Black characters with their hands on my shoulder. And that was my getting a faculty position gift from Desiree. She's amazing. So I'm putting all of that like fandom up front to say that actually things that we learn from Star Trek is what goals in Star Trek are. Which is that if you watch DS9, which anybody who doesn't watch Star Trek, please go watch DS9, because it is about Black freedom. It is about the fight against anti-Semitism. It is about Palestinian liberation. It is about the Irish resistance against British colonialism. It's a powerful show. It also points to the fact that the Federation has authoritarian features that have been unpacked in the previous, that have gone unpacked in the previous series. And Discovery is doing some of that, but because they have dislocated Discovery in space and time, and I think I'm being vague enough that I haven't spoiled it too much for people, it doesn't actually do that work of critiquing the Federation in the ways that the Federation should be critiqued. So I would say watch Star Trek, because it does give us a vision of the future, and then look for the things that it doesn't do well and think about how you can integrate those critiques into a vision of a better future than the one that Star Trek promises us.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that approach to fandom. That is like, that it's not, adulation, it's actually engagement, right? That's what, right, which is what we want in general. But there's so much pressure to just sort of be acolytes, when in fact I think it's less loving of the work itself.
Yeah. I guess the one comment I will make about this is someone who goes to the convention was like having to deal with the fact that, like you said, so the convention is like my pride event. It's like extremely queer. You have het cis dudes walking around in skirts because it's the one place where like nobody's like, what are you doing? And that's like an interesting conversation on its own. So we go into what's called Quark's Bar, which is like the place where everybody goes to have lunch, which for anyone who's watched DS9, Quark is a character, not a particle in the show. And you sit down at a table and you don't know who you're sitting next to. And in many ways, Star Trek is the future. But also one time I sat down next to some people and they were like, the women in Trek panel was so upsetting because they just kept talking about feminism. And it became like really clear very quickly that I was sitting next to some Trump voters who were also like huge Star Trek fans. And one of them was in her Trek cheer uniform. And I actually joined the Trek cheer squad the following year. I have a uniform, right? And so for me, what was interesting was finding myself in this context where people were seeing things in the show that I didn't realize. Like, I didn't know how you could be a Trump voter and a Star Trek fan at the same time. realizing that there is a way of reading the show in that way, I think, can be instructive, that maybe it's not doing everything that it can be doing. Although certainly people are real mad about Sonequa Martin Green being the lead of Discovery, and that's part of what makes her being the lead of the show so wonderful. Is she's great, and it upsets all the right people.
Okay, another one, another question. I'm going to come back to a question about Star Trek later, but you mentioned that particle physicists should look to and stand in solidarity with artists who struggle to have their work valued. What are some of the most important lessons scientists can learn from artists?
Yeah, so I think, one is being scrappy with very little. Because if nothing else, artists are scrappy with very little. I don't want to idealize artists as, always forward-thinking, progressive people. Like I grew up a T.S. Eliot fan, and he was an anti-Semite. I was introduced to T.S. Eliot by my father, who is the Jewish parent, right? I came to be a huge E.E. Cummings fan when I was in college, and he was a fascist supporter. So I'm bringing this up because I think that we have to be really careful about idealizing people in any of these professional or intellectual locations as the ones who are better at something. Universally or holistically. But I also think that we can look to, I think a really good example of this is the work of Afrofuturist artists. And the person that I will name here is Itasha Womack, who has done an amazing job of first of all, making sure that Afrofuturism continues to be on people's lips in a way, even in a rooted way that goes back to what is intellectual lineage and artistic lineage. That Afrofuturists, for example, point to ways that we can think techno-scientifically that are different from the ways that we are thinking techno-scientifically now. And so I think that that's one example of a lesson that we can learn from artists, is that actually sometimes artists are telling us about science. And I think another example I will use of that is Charles Yu's How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe. Is really at its heart, like a story about a father and a son, but it is also like this incredibly beautiful take on general relativity and time and how time works. And actually, when I teach general relativity, I'm going to put that book on the syllabus as optional. I think that sometimes artists are telling us about our own work. Mm-hmm. So I will just say that sometimes the best questions I get about science are from the people who are not experts, the ones that really get me thinking differently about what my work is doing in the world. And so I think, maybe that's not specific to artists, but I will say that artists are often the ones who are taking the thing and rotating it before we do that. Mm-hmm. And then later, maybe we come to that and we're like, oh, we should have rotated that earlier.
It makes me think. One of the parts in the book that really kind of struck me was about you describing that what you do is math, because, and I've told you this before, I loved calculus physics. I didn't understand at all, and part of it was I couldn't imagine spatially. Like I could deal with abstraction, but I couldn't. Had really struggled with spatial understanding.
Same.
Okay. But my best friend, who was a painter, was like a physics whiz, and it was just this sort of imagining moving through space just felt, it was almost like kind of organic for her. And so the way that you talk both about sociality but also space-time is just, I think, has implications like in really broad ways, part of which is to be able to see all of the creative work that we do in scientific terms, which I think is really liberatory, frankly, because this sort of segregation of disciplines actually, I think, is kind of, shutters our imagination. But also, relatedly, there was a question about the painting behind you.
Yes. Yeah, so this is a painting by Shaniqua Gay, who I don't know if Shaniqua is in the audience tonight. She's an Atlanta-based artist. Genius. Let's say like Shaniqua is brilliant. There's a sketch of this painting in the book. So if you open to the title page and look to the other side, there's a sketch. This is a painting that I commissioned from Shaniqua. So I said all of that without giving the name first because I gave it the name, but I really want people to see Shaniqua's vision without thinking about my name. So the name is We Were Always Scientists. And what I said to Shaniqua was that I wanted to have something in my office when I became a professor finally, because I had managed to pull that off. That reminded me that even though I was breaking a barrier in some ways as the first Black American woman to be tenure track faculty in both theoretical cosmology or particle theory, that I was part of a lineage. And so the vision I gave her was, I want a painting of enslaved Black women who are doing science anyway. And so I guess like the lighting is a little bit funky here, but they've got some green stuff in a glass jar. That's maybe some tomato leaf, like distillation from tomato leaves, which folks might know that tomatoes are from the deadly nightshade family. And they've got a bowl. They're maybe in the kitchen. The white like spots or bluish spots that you're seeing are galaxies and gravitational lens distortions. So Shaniqua just asked me, what are some images that relate to your work? So I sent her the Hubble Space Telescope Ultra Deep Field, which is one of the deepest images we've ever taken of the universe. And the sketch that people can see in the book, this is one reason you want to pick up a copy of the book, is the sketch that Shaniqua sent back to me. So that's the story behind the painting. And I really want to encourage particularly folks who are in the Atlanta area, if you have the opportunity to go to one of her shows, please do. She's incredible. And I would say that collaborating with her on this painting, although mostly it was Shaniqua, I was the one who was like, let's do the tomatoes. We had a very deep conversation about what vegetables would be on the table. I got a friend out of it, and it was a beautiful collaboration opportunity. And I would say, going back to the question about what can we learn from artists, I learned how to see my ancestors in a different way. And I will say I had a really tough moment in the last year where some scientists were really trying me. And I sat down and had a conversation with the ladies in the painting. Yeah, for me, it's become, I have an ancestor altar with my grandparents somewhere else, but this is another ancestor altar for me.
Your description reminded me, I went to a colonial house in Maryland, and where they had enslaved people, and I went with a docent into the basement at a moment, and they were telling a story about where the kitchen was in the basement. They were telling a story about the cooking and sleeping on the floor in the sweltering heat and all. And at a certain point I realized, okay, so this cook was a woman who wasn't literate, who knew how to make all of these sumptuous meals. The amount of science that she had to know was extraordinary, right? And there's no record of it, but there's evidence, and all the paintings of everything that they ate and the stories that they documented, but we don't know her name.
So I guess let me just add to that, like one of the thoughts, because I'm realizing this is in my head but maybe not communicated, is when we talk about, like, I grew up understanding slavery was terrible in all of the ways, and in the case of my ancestors, the ones whose geography I'm able to trace were dealing with sugarcane in Barbados. I think as I understood it as a child, and embarrassingly into adulthood was that people were just doing like mindless labor. And there was a moment, actually, I was watching the TV show Underground, Misha Green's sort of short-lived show Underground, which is basically a heist show where these enslaved folks are going to steal themselves, right? That's the heist. And I was like, oh man, I've been misunderstanding this, that like enslaved folks were running those plantations. Enslaved folks were experts. They were agriculturalists, not just, I knew about midwives, agriculturalists, chemists. Like my girl Ray Burks, who's part of my Bonnets and Bottles crew, is a chemist. And like, this is like, she's part of a long line of chemists, like we were just talking about. That we had folks who knew how to build things, even though they couldn't do calculation on paper, that they were engineers.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very important just to go way back to the question about like, murderous inclusion, that we need to start rejecting the story that like Black people are new to science, because we've been doing it the whole time. What's different now is that maybe we get to fully live that experience of being a scientist on our own terms.
Right. To choose being scientist.
Yes.
Oh, that's beautiful. Okay, someone wrote, I'm really loving this talk because so rarely do I see another physicist, this is Fionn McClary, who prioritizes their moral compass as consistently and vocally as you. How do you get people on your side when you make choices that many may not understand because the choices are morally grounded, but perhaps not so career-oriented? How do you get others in your field to care as much as you do, I guess? She said, for context, student. Yes, okay.
Yeah, I think that that's a really fantastic question. And I just want to acknowledge, I don't know you, but the loneliness that maybe some of that question is coming from, that it can actually be a very lonely journey. And I had many very lonely moments. And so I just want to say, I come from an organizer's family. The answer is always solidarity. And there are people who are in solidarity with you, and you have to be flexible about where they come from. So one of the lessons that I had to learn was that, like, some of my biggest Black scientist cheerleaders were not going to be physicists. I had to stop looking at the Black physics community as the only place where I could find Black and STEM community. And so I found it with, I know Danielle Lee is in the audience, and I just want to name Danielle as like the OG. Like, this book exists in part because like Danielle was blogging as the urban scientist at Scientific American when I was in graduate school, and I got the idea to start a blog partly because like Danielle was doing that writing. Danielle is someone that I can trust to be real with me if I need to have a conversation, and so I also like will still call home and talk to my mother about strategy. My mom may not know physics, but my mom knows strategy. I think the other piece of advice I will particularly give to people who have relationships with cis men, with het cis men, is if you're going to be with that dude has got to be on board with supporting you. That's like not even a little bit negotiable. It is a non-negotiable, and I think that is not said often enough. Yes. That my spouse has been incredible. He does a lot of the housework, partly because I am disabled. I have chronic pain, and him doing that helps minimize that. It gave me freedom to write and think. So I just want to say, like, these are all different forms of solidarity and support, and it's good to be flexible about how you find them. So build a team that will cheer you on. And I don't mean cheer you on, like, no matter what, like, fuck shit thing you do, they tell you you're great. They'll be like, okay, I see what you were trying to do there. Maybe you should have done it like that. And I remember this happened to me recently, that Ray said to me, like, look, Chanda, I think this thing is sketch. And I was like, no, Ray, I checked it out and it's fine. And like 3 weeks later, I had to be like, yo, Ray, I should have just listened to you because that was a hot mess, right? So people that you can learn from and who are going to look out for you, even if you're foolish like I was, and sometimes don't listen to them. And those people don't have to be scientists. They don't have to know exactly what you do. They don't have to know how to calculate what you calculate. They have to be ready to support you in being a scientist and support you in holding on to your values and be ready to strategize with you.
You just mentioned having chronic pain, which I think is really important. I mean, it's important for me to have other people who talk about chronic disease, and I think for all of us, right, who live with. And you also, in many ways, talk about the reality of a kind of an embodied, fleshy experience, not as a kind of, and I don't mean to say it this way to sound dismissive of others, but not as a kind of tabulation, right? And you talk about rape as part of this science story, that chapter, right? It's trauma, the way that it repeats, it can knock us down, the way that our bodies react, our perception is affected. All of these parts of living are part of science, right? And not and moving through the world isn't I don't know how else to say this, but it's not like these sort of little boxes that we can separate, right? We move through this world that is violent and cruel and painful, and we do what we do in all of that. You have a quote from your mother. I can't remember what exactly it was, but about none of us is like the worst thing that's happened to us, which is not dismissive. Yes, go ahead. Yes, please.
Can I read it? So this is one of the epigraphs of the book. The other is the very talented poet and scientist Lena Blackman, who I want people to look up. People need to know that we live in a universe that is bigger than the bad things that are happening to us. And that was my mom, Margaret Prescott. I just want to say, she said that to me offhand on a phone call, and I wrote it down and stuck it to our front door. And I'm certain that she didn't realize that I would put it in a book.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, like, you know, when it comes to like dealing with chronic pain, I think that one of the things is that my pain has taught me about the power of money and the problematic power of money, which is how much having access to resources that when I started out as a postdoctoral fellow at NASA, I was on maximum doses of 2 different over-the-counter painkillers every single day. And what changed that was being able to afford to go to classical Pilates lessons and become a certified classical Pilates instructor, which helped. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which like helped me unwind some of the pain patterns and movements that had me in pain patterns, gave my muscles an opportunity to heal from trauma from a car accident that happened when I was 19. While I was a summer researcher biking from MIT to Harvard one evening. And also has allowed me to know how to manage it when it comes up. Like, I am now a certified body worker. I know how to work with ice and with heat. And I don't know if I would be where I am as a faculty person had I not had access to the fiscal resources and really the friends who provided me with fiscal resources. I had my first year as a postdoc, I had a friend who sent me $500 every month and paid my student loans for me because she could afford to. And I was drowning in being able to pay for my weekly body work. No one should have to be lucky enough to have gone to Harvard and have the kinds of friends who have money to get to where I am. And so I just want to acknowledge that, you know, it's easy to call that privilege or whatever, but it's just like a broken system.
Yeah.
Like it's not a,
yes. Mm-hmm.
It's like, I really think that like privilege can be a very limited framework in this respect, because it tells us that like, it's okay to be an exception by calling it a privilege, or to focus on the exception. And I just want to focus on the fact that the system is broken and that I don't want to be articulated as proof that you know, it's fine. Because it's like not. it's like not fine. It's not fine that like my health insurance didn't pay for any of what I needed. And that was true actually in Canada, as well as I was a PhD student in Canada. But I actually went into heavy debt in graduate school paying for physical therapy in Canada because it wasn't covered by the Ontario Health Insurance Program, which my international student insurance mirrored. So also, I just want to say to all the Americans in the audience, we need something better than what Canada has. Aspire to something greater.
Yes.
But I really like it. Disabled people can't be at the mercy of charity. And right now we are left at the mercy of charity. And that's messed up.
Well, there's something about, I think both, that's absolutely right, that to focus on the system and the structure, and that, but also that what you described as healing modalities, ways you have the experience actually opens up, I think, the sense of possibility about what might be in ways that are profound. So we are almost at the very end. I actually want to end with the very first question that was asked, which was, how did your mom feel after finding that she did play an important part in your growth? Yeah, and maybe also how she feels now in terms of the world of this book, the life of this book.
Yeah, so I guess I should be clear that I don't think that there was ever a point where my mom didn't feel like she was playing an important role. And I think that even when there were struggles, because she's one of the co-founders, along with Wilmette Brown, of Black Women for Wages for Housework, my mom is good at seeing unwaged work. And if I'm good at looking at structures, and I think that this is true scientifically as well, is because I trained at her side as someone who looks for what is the structure at work here and not just like what's happening with the individual pieces. But my mom's a Bajan. So when I was on Ebro in the morning on Hot 97, like 2 weeks ago, I think my mom texted that video to half of Barbados. So yeah, my mom's still at the end of the day, she's still a proud mom. She tweets at me from my mom has a daily radio show that's nationally syndicated called Sojourner Truth with Margaret Prescott. And 100% my mom uses the show account to tweet at me, and she will sign them, love mom. Mom's still a mom. No. And I don't think that diminishes her in any way. I think that she sees that as a really important job that she has been playing, and a really important job that she's been doing, and that her political task is being a mother recognized as work that is deserving of economic recognition and compensation and a massive social contribution. So I think it's all very consistent with her politics to be a totally over the top Caribbean mom.
Right. And also, I think I see that in you as well, because you are the model for ensuring that you're going to recognize the labor that is getting done by all of us, right? It is a disposition of both self-regard and incredible generosity. And I'm saying that, from my heart as someone who feels as though I benefit from it directly, that, we occupy a space and time in which a kind of self-involvement is really in so many ways the norm, even among people who claim to be organizers, but to think about the collective and your experience as rooted in that is so important. So thank you so much, Chanda.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. and thank you. Let me just also acknowledge Imani as someone who will respond to my text messages at various times about various things. So also don't be afraid to talk to your heroes. Meeting your heroes is not always terrible, no matter how that saying goes.
All right. I think that we are done. Also, for everybody who's been in the, thank you to everyone in the audience too. Wonderful presence and questions and comments.
Are we waiting for?
Yeah, sorry, just having a moment.
Yes. Okay, here we go.
My bad. Thank you to
Okay.
everybody who just was so brilliant in the chat, and those questions were really deep and thoughtful. I love that, and thank you to you both. This conversation was so beautiful. I want to let folks know that the Disordered Cosmos is actually out of stock because it is so popular. It is out of stock at the warehouse, which is both a good and a bad problem. But we have copies at Charis. So we ordered copies for the event. We have them physically. So what we need is for folks who don't have the book to just give us a call or shoot us an email, and we will get you your book. So we apologize that it is not a one-click order, but we do have books. We really want to get them into your hands. We really appreciate it when you support independent feminist bookstores. It matters a lot. To that end, also, our events are sponsored by our nonprofit, Charis Circle. Charis Circle has been doing feminist movement work in the South for more than 20 years. We really appreciate any donations to help fund that work. So $1, $3 really does make a difference in our work and helps us fund this platform and helps us fund other opportunities for other folks. So if you were able to drop a little bit our way, we really do appreciate it. We also want to encourage you, if this is your first time here, please do check out our full calendar of events at www.charisbooksandmore.com. We stay busy, so we would love for you to stay busy with us and come to more events with Charis. No matter where you live in the world, we like to build feminist community with you. So this event was really, truly a gift. And I know that lots of folks will want to revisit it. So I want to let you know that as soon as this is over, it will immediately repopulate and you'll be able to watch it all over again. You can revisit the chat. It will stay up. So these resources from Auburn Avenue, which are just consistently such a gift, they will stay up. So you can come back, you can open all the links, you can do all the things, and they will be here for you. So thank you both so much. I hope you stay safe and well.
You too.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, have a good night.